All right, so we're rolling here. So Rachel, welcome to the Iron Life podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, it's awesome to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So why don't we start with a little bit of your backstory and kind of just tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Yes. So backstory. Well, I guess an intro. I'm a functional medicine nutritionist here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I'm also a fitness model and I do some public speaking as well too. I have my own private practice in functional medicine. Oftentimes I get asked, what the heck is functional medicine? And really that just means root cause. So if you kind of look at traditional Western medicine, I call it the Band-Aid approach. So we kind of attempt to fix symptoms. For example, let's say you go to the doctor for depression, you're given an antidepressant versus taking a root cause approach as to why these symptoms occur. A diabetic may go to the doctor, be given insulin statins for their insulin resistance, but we're not really looking at the root cause, which is, being in the wellness industry, diet and lifestyle factors play a huge role. So that's what functional medicine is. It's more of taking that root cause approach. And I do a lot of lab testing with my nutrition practice as well, but kind of rewinding a bit as to how I actually got into functional medicine. I actually grew up really, really unhealthy. So my father was mentally ill and my mom spent most nights out partying, drinking. So my siblings and I basically had to raise ourselves. And I was the middle kid. And of course, we all took that on us very individually. But I was the type where, I could have gotten into a lot of bad things. My siblings even got into drugs and alcohol. And I was kind of on the sports side of things. So that kept me in a really good place because I had a lot of people I was surrounded around that kept me motivated in regards to sports. So I was a gymnast and I was a dancer. And being involved in sports growing up, that's what kind of started me to want to learn more about health and wellness because I had no parental supervision. I could be gone for days and I was probably living off of things like McDonald's and like stored Halloween candy that I had just like stored up from years in my drawers of everything. And I would like eat those as meals. So I grew up really, really unhealthy actually. And I ate like whatever I wanted. And, but I was very interested in sports. And when I went off to college, and I went to Baylor for nutrition and dietetics, that's kind of when I really got into more of the health and wellness side. And I think for me, because I grew up so unhealthy and kind of watching my mom and, my siblings as well too, I kind of went the complete opposite direction. I was like the black sheep in my family, but kind of in the other direction where I wanted to be like nothing like what I was brought up in with my family. And that's something we can definitely dive into, kind of like that mindset, but you can always go either direction. It's like that. Your father was an alcoholic and, this is all I've ever known. So this is all I'm ever going to be. Or you can kind of have the mindset of, I want to be nothing like this. And that's kind of the mindset that I had for myself. So when I went off to Baylor, that's when I really got into nutrition and health, but I was no longer in sports. I was no longer doing gymnastics or dance. So that's when I actually started to pick up weightlifting, and I got into bodybuilding at that point in my life and studying nutrition and bodybuilding. This is where actually the fitness freak that most people see online today, like really came to life. And I was really, really good at it. And I think part of it was because I grew up as a gymnast and dancer. I think there's a little bit of a genetic component to that as well too. I do have some pretty good genes in my family, but I got really into the fitness side, and it actually took kind of, as I began, a turn for something that started out really good to almost on the extreme side. So it started off as a very healthy outlet for me, and kind of given my background and growing up in a very unhealthy environment, it was kind of like a positive way for me to cope with a lot of those things. But as I started to get into it more and more, I kind of went on that extreme side with dieting, with overtraining. I was competing in bodybuilding or the bikini category. And that's when I started to have a lot of health issues actually that came about. I started to get gut issues. So I had chronic bloating and distension of my stomach. All my hormones plummeted. So I kind of put myself in a in an early menopause, which is it's called medical menopause, based off of your adrenals and how your body kind of shuts down your hormone production as a female. My thyroid started to be affected. So I started to have, at age, I think, 22 years old, all of these health issues start to come about. And from the outside, it looked like I was like the epitome of health. I was shredded. I had six-pack abs. I mean, everybody was like, what are you doing? You look amazing. But on the inside, like, I felt like shit. And everything was off within my body. And it was at that point where I was very, very depressed, and which makes sense because all my hormones and thyroid and gut was messed up. I mean, no one's going to feel good like that. And just the massive amount of pressure that I was putting under myself as well too, and stress. So I ended up going to a lot of different doctors during that time. I had a lot of misdiagnosis, and kind of the main thing for me was the gut stuff. I could no longer like eat anything anymore without being in severe pain. So I did all the scans. I did colonoscopy, endoscopy, CT scan, MRI, after going to all these different doctors. And I was always just given the label of, you have IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome. They gave me things like antidepressants. They gave me, like laxatives. Here, take a probiotic. But it was all just kind of going back to that functional medicine approach, putting a Band-Aid over the issue. We weren't actually really getting to the root cause as to why all these things were off. And now hindsight's definitely 2020, and I can look back at my lifestyle as to what that was like. But at the time, I was just like, what the heck is going on? Like, I'm young, I'm healthy, I'm fit. Like, why are all these things happening? Why am I getting all these gut issues, hormone, thyroid issues? It just didn't make sense to me at the time. I kind of just thought of nutrition as more on the aesthetic side, on fitness and weight loss. And I had yet to really enter this whole realm of functional medicine. And it wasn't until I finally ended up at a colorectal surgeon's office who wanted to cut out my entire large intestine. And that was his solution, was he just wanted to cut out my entire organ. Because my gut issues were so bad, I could not really use the restroom anymore. And that was basically how they were going to fix the issue. So that was kind of like the rock bottom for me, in all honesty. Me sitting there in the office, debating going through this surgery where, one, my colon wasn't diseased. There was nothing wrong with me, like visually, when they did all these scans, but the functionality was off with my gut. And it never felt right, but I was in so much pain, and I was so desperate at that time. I was highly considering getting the surgery, but sitting there in that office, I was just like, there has to be some other way to figure out what's going on. Why are all these things happening? And I decided to give myself like 6 months. Like, I'm going to try all these other different methods and really try to dig to the bottom of this on my own and try to figure out what's going on before I move forward with the surgery. So that's kind of when I became laser focused on more of this side of things, the internal health. And given my background in nutrition and dietetics, I had a good foundation. It just really wasn't on, the hormones, the gut health side of things. So that's when I started just researching like a mad woman, everything about gut health, the microbiome, learning about a neuroendocrine system and the hormones and the adrenals and, stress and how that plays a role. And I had to make a lot of changes, which we can certainly dive into, of course. But over time, I was able to heal myself, and it wasn't like a quick, like, oh my gosh, I had everything figured out. But I had to make a lot of changes with the way I was training. Honestly, my mental health as well, too, with the massive amount of pressure I was putting on myself. Diet as well, too, with restriction. I worked a lot on my gut health and the microbiome, and I had no idea how much that played a role as well, too. Worked on balancing my hormones with nutrition. But what I did is I took a functional approach, looking at the root of the issue. And that's what got me into functional medicine. And because of that, I decided to get another certification in functional medicine and kind of add that to what I was already doing with nutrition. And then that's kind of where my current nutrition practice was created, kind of just based off of a lot of the issues I went through, and now me wanting to help other people get to the root cause of their health issues, build confidence, or even optimize their overall health and wellness.
Wow. And the first thing
Yeah.
that, so you and I definitely have a lot in common when it goes back to the
Yeah.
family stuff. That's the first thing I want to talk about because, I have drug addiction in my family. I've come from, a pretty toxic environment growing up, and sports and lifting are really, those were the things that got me going in the other direction. Because I could have
Hmm.
very well been going down the path of drugs and all that too, and I was for a little bit, like when probably as early as 12 years old, I was drinking alcohol, smoking pot, 13,
Mm.
14. And, something shifted when I got a little bit more into football, and that started to take me down the path of lifting and all that.
Hmm.
So I'm just curious. So you said sports, that was kind of the thing that started to lead you in the other direction. Was it a mentor, or was it that you were just obsessed with, with a specific sport, or what was it for you that really led you down the other path? Or was it just your desire to not be like everybody else? I could completely relate to that as well.
That's a really good question. And I've been asked that quite a bit. They're like, was there a mentor or somebody? Because normally it's like there's that person that kind of helps pull you out of it, right? I honestly look back and I can't think of any person in particular. I think though I watched my older sister, and my sister was 3 years older than me. And I watched her get involved in things like drugs and alcohol. And actually, at one point, she even tried to kill herself because of just the massive amount of trauma that she had gone through. She was older than me and she experienced things a lot on a much deeper level than I did. So I think just watching her and see the massive amount of hurt that she went through, I wanted to choose something different for myself, and I saw everything that she went through. So she was in a way kind of my motivating factor in that sense. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. So then you went to school, and then you started competing. Um, so that's something that, because there's girls that will, that I'll talk to that are in their 20s, and they're thinking about getting into, whether it be physique or bodybuilding or figure, whatever, bikini. So one piece of advice that I tell them is usually you might want to reconsider it, only because
Yeah.
of the hormonal effects that it could cause, especially for females, because bringing their body fat so low, as you know, could really start to mess with your hormones and a lot of other things too, right?
Hmm.
So, what about you? Like, so when you started doing that, how far into it did you start to realize that, okay, something's out of whack here? I'm not feeling great. Did you compete for a long time, or was it a couple months into it, or?
Hmm. Yeah, so I think for most people, it starts out as a very healthy endeavor. We want to better ourselves. We kind of want to see what we're capable of. We've never really been to that, epitome of a physique where you get up on the stage and you're like at this low percent body fat and you're in a bikini. And it's very empowering as well too. And I don't regret competing by any means. Now I wish I maybe would have done it a different way as I got into it. But I think it always starts out for most people healthy, and then it evolves over time. And for me, I competed for about maybe 4 years, but it was that last year, maybe last 2 years, that it kind of took a turn. And I kind of noticed myself that's all I cared about. For me, I believe that your health, fitness, and all of that should allow you to live your life better, should add to your life, but it shouldn't be your whole life. We want to eat better, have better health so we can have better relationships, so we can do better in our business, so we can have more happiness in our life. And I think when it starts to actually take away from that and it makes you feel worse and you have less confidence and your whole life is just surrounded around, I have to be at this perfect percent body fat, and I have to get in all my perfect meals and I have to train at this time. And you're neglecting your friends, your family, your mental health. And honestly, you feel like you're going the opposite direction. I think that's when it kind of takes that turn. And I would say it was that last year competing where I was actually trying to get to the pro level. So I was competing at that national level. And, you know, most girls at that level, you know, they start to do things that maybe aren't very healthy. You know, I don't say a lot of women in bikini take steroids because we're not trying to get big. But, you know, they'll do things that do mess with their hormones. You know, they'll take things to help with burning fat. But I think it mainly just comes down to the massive amount of mental stress and perfectionism that you're also putting on your body to get to a certain point and then being judged, you know. And I always was being critiqued like my abs were too hard. And I've always been known for Rachel Scheer with six pack abs. And, you know, they were like, oh, you need to soften that up. And it was just like, why am I doing this? Am I doing this for a judge or am I doing this for me? And that's kind of where you have to reevaluate it. And I think most people, it starts out for them. They're like, I want to be the greatest version of myself and I want to feel awesome. And, you know, I want to feel really confident and I want to prove to myself that I can do this. And I'm like, hell yeah, let's go. That's awesome. Let's, you know, and I think the mental fortitude and grit like you develop when competing is really, really awesome because you have to be on it every single day to get to that level. Like there's no half-assing it. There's no cheating. You develop a lot of great skills along the way, but it's at that point where, why are you doing this? Are you doing this now for you? Or are you doing this for other people or trying to appease a judge? And it was when it really transitioned to, and I started to care, I think, about what more of what other people thought and, you know, just getting that trophy and wanting to get that label. And it wasn't about me and bettering myself anymore, was when I really had to pull back. And I still get asked today, people are like, why don't you compete? You should definitely compete. You do awesome. And I'm like, because I don't really care to anymore. And I'm like, you know, it was a great part of my life and I learned so much. And I honestly wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today and helping the amount of people if I didn't do it. And I think I developed a lot as a person doing that, but I don't want to do it again. Like I definitely don't.
I could relate to you there. I competed for about 3 years and I have zero desire to ever do it again.
Yeah, you know, for me, this lifestyle, it's about being that greatest version of me. And yes, setting goals and crushing them, accomplishing them, and looking badass in a bikini and a swimsuit. Like hell yeah, all women want that, and guys want to look good too. But it's kind of like, is it taking away or adding to your life? And that's always the question you have to ask yourself.
Totally. And what was your diet like back then when you were competing and compared to what it's like now, just for people listening?
Oh my gosh. Well, back then I was tracking every little morsel that like crossed my mouth. And that's what happens when you're competing. I mean, it's not just eating healthy and getting in the good amount of protein and focusing on whole foods, you know, cutting out the processed foods. I mean, every little food is measured that crosses your mouth. You know, you're hitting a very specific amount of protein, carbs, and fats that you're getting every day. So it was more of the quantity that I was doing. And I think even that obsessive amount too. So it's like, if I didn't hit it perfectly, you know, I felt like I was a failure. And if I was above or below, I was a failure because I had to track everything, you know, to create that physique, which was honestly like what, maybe for me, 4%, 5% body fat lower than what I'm currently at. But I had to do so much more work. And I was so focused on that it took away from, again, my relationships, from my business, from all these other areas in my life where now, you know, I'm maybe, you know, 4 or 5% body fat higher, which is still really, I mean, I'm still incredibly fit. Most people would be like, you could still compete, but it's not like quite at that level, but I can maintain it easily without even thinking about it, not tracking calories, not tracking macros, but still focused on eating healthy and still focused on whole foods, getting in high quality protein, getting in lots of healthy fats. And I think that's incredibly important. And when it comes to blood sugar, to hormones, and then since I am training and I love training and that's something I'll never stop doing, you know, I do eat a good amount of carbohydrates to fuel that as well too. So it's more now about like, what do I need to fuel what I'm trying to do, what's going to help me feel good. So it's a little bit more of an intuitive approach now versus then it was more like, I have to get this to the T, tracking every little macronutrient and calorie that kind of crossed my mouth. And that can be pretty stressful.
Oh, that's for sure. Yeah, a little bit more relaxed, right? When instead, otherwise, when you're competing, you are so set, and you're probably putting off cheat meals for months, and then when you do, at least for me, so I would go 16 weeks, no cheats whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And then, after the show where you just completely destroy everything in your sight for about 72
Yeah.
hours. So speaking of gut and digestive issues, I had a bunch of them myself. And speaking of that,
Mm-hmm.
so with that, so once you found out that, okay, they want to remove your large intestine, and you started to do this deep dive into gut health, what did you find, and how did you fix it?
Yeah, so before I dive into that, I think it's good to explain as to how these things come about. And this is something that it's not like my clinical model, but how disease or imbalances happen in the body. When I say disease, think like dis-ease in the body, that imbalance. But there's normally some kind of a stressor that comes about. So this could be physical stress, this could be an injury, this could be overtraining, like I was during competing. This could be a dietary stress, this could be like if you had a food sensitivity, this could be blood sugar imbalances, this could be under eating, overeating, maybe for some people. Sometimes it can be lifestyle, so lack of sleep as well too. Lots of emotional stress, so there's an emotional stress component as well too, trauma, just like your daily stress load when it comes to work. And then there are other things like if you're exposed to bacteria, virus, mold, heavy metals. So there's all these different factors that could be stressors. And, for most people, it varies, of course. For me, there was definitely the physical stress with the training, the dietary stress. There was the emotional stress there too. But what happens is our neuroendocrine system is actually affected first. So our cortisol, our stress hormone, which is good, we need it, but it's chronically elevated. And when that's chronically elevated and we're in this state of fight or flight, we're never really in that rest and digest, that parasympathetic state. So when we're in that fight or flight state, our whole digestive system shuts down because it's like running from a tiger. When you're running from a tiger, you don't want to be thinking about going to the bathroom, digesting your food. You want to utilize all of the blood sugar for running from that tiger. So when that's chronically elevated over time, it does a couple of things though. One, it makes us very catabolic. So cortisol is very catabolic and it starts to break things down. This is why we can break things down like muscle tissue, but it also breaks down the gut lining. So a lot of people don't realize that the gut lining is only one cell thick and it's also a muscle. So when we have this chronic level of stress from whatever those stressors could be, chronic levels of cortisol, we get very catabolic. Now, when you're a bodybuilder, you're doing everything you can to prevent being catabolic, getting in all the protein, the resistance training to prevent the muscle breakdown, but the gut's definitely affected by that. And especially since we're never in that rest and digest state. And then with that whole neuroendocrine system, there's a connection between your adrenals, that cortisol, between your hormones, between your energy production, your thyroid. So really this whole cascade, it's like a domino effect. Your thyroid's affected, you get hypothyroidism, which is basically your body like trying to conserve whatever energy it has. Females' hormones start to plummet as well too. So this is when women are basically like, hey, we're not in a healthy state right now due to this massive amount of stress to even reproduce. Sometimes that can be related to body fat, but even just overall stress as well too. But all of this neuroendocrine system starts to be affected. And that's when we get a lot of, the anxiety, we get a lot of the weight issues that even start to come about, hormonal. And then because the gut lining started to break down, this is really when the gut starts to be affected for most people, because we start to get things like leaky gut. Because that gut lining is affected, we get things like food sensitivities. We start to get things like bacteria that can affect the microbiome. So not as much good bacteria like probiotics and overgrowth of bad bacteria. You can pick up those more easily. So this leads to things like gut dysbiosis over time. And then our immune system takes a huge hit as well too. So it's kind of like this cascade of events. It's like all these different stressors, and normally there's more than one. And it's kind of like that perfect storm. And then when it happens like chronically over time, our neuroendocrine system is dysregulated. And because of how catabolic that makes us and how it affects our immune system, this is when our gut lining is affected and all these gut issues come about. So, it really makes sense to me now, but of course, not many people have that knowledge as to how that happens. And it's not also like you have some kind of a stressor and then like, oh my gosh, all this is going to happen. It's when it's chronically elevated for a long period of time that all these things come about. You know, stress is something that we all experience, and we need that cortisol. It's actually very, very helpful. So it's like when you're running from that tiger, we need that cortisol. It's going to help us get out of that situation. But it's when it's every single day, you know, we're under that massive amount of stress, and then it's making us really inflamed, it's going to start to cause a lot of disease in the body ultimately. So I'm trying to remember what your question was. But,
Yeah. So no, that was great. And the question was, so what did you start to do to fix those issues when you were kind of, you had that 6-month period that you gave yourself, you didn't want surgery. So where did you begin? Because there might be people listening to this right now with very similar issues and IBS and, you know, other things like that going on that might be saying, okay, well, what could I do?
You know, a couple of things. You need to look at the internal, what's going on there. And then you also need to look at the mental health side of things along with it. So for me, getting the proper testing was really important. And when you go to your normal doctor, they're not running the type of testing that really you need. So basically the labs they run is going to look at organ function. They'll look at cholesterol, lipid profile. They'll maybe do a CBC to kind of see if there's any kind of major infections, and then maybe vitamin D and B12. And if everything checks out, they're like, great, you're in perfect health. And you're like, oh my gosh, no, I'm not. Why do I feel I'm so awful? I have these gut issues. I have all this stuff going on. They're like, oh, you just have IBS. You know, anyway, but they don't really look at the things that we need to look at. So one, getting the proper testing, I think, is incredibly important in seeking out a functional medicine practitioner. Now, I'm a functional medicine nutritionist, so I don't use medicine. I basically utilize lifestyle changes and very specific like supplement protocols as well. But getting the testing and looking at your hormones, looking at all of your hormones, not just your sex hormones, but you also need to look at your full thyroid. And most doctors will just look at something called TSH, but you need to look at T3, T4, you need to look at reverse T3, you need to look at thyroid antibodies for things like autoimmune. You need to look at your insulin, your blood sugar levels. You need to look at that stress hormone, cortisol. So you need to look at all of your hormones and see where those are at. And then you need to look at things such as your micronutrients for deficiencies. You maybe need to look a little bit further at like your gut, your microbiome, if you have symptoms that are residing in the gut. Because when it comes to things like IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, we're really, most often, if we do all of the other testing, you know, everything comes back normal. But we know that the gut microbiome plays such a huge role in our overall health. That's all the little microbes that reside in the gut. And they do everything from our immune system to produce serotonin. So it plays a huge role in our brain function, to the motility and the transit of the foods we have, to helping synthesize various vitamins and minerals. So if that's imbalance, that's going to cause a lot of issues. So these are just some of the tests that I recommend definitely doing, but looking at the gut, looking at all of your hormones. So that's looking at that neuroendocrine system and that gut, and kind of looking at those two systems because they're very interconnected. So I did a lot of testing, and I found out I had SIBO, which is called bacteria overgrowth in the gut. And I had to do quite a few different protocols to repair that. I had leaky gut, which is normally found in most people with bacteria overgrowth in the gut as well too. So I had to do a lot of things from a dietary standpoint to work on repairing the gut lining. So if you follow me on social media, I'm always talking about like glutamine for the guts, and there's a lot of other things that are great. But in like workout recovery, we're always talking about glutamine and how that's awesome for repairing muscle tissue. In school, we learned that glutamine is really great for repairing the gut lining. And you can also do things like aloe vera, licorice is really good. And then of course, diet's gonna play the biggest role. So that's cutting out things that are pro-inflammatory to the diet, industrial seed oils, vegetable oils. For me, grains were pretty inflammatory to my body during that time as well too. So I cut those out. And then adding in a lot of the good stuff. So adding in a lot of the healthy fats. And that was really important for me to kind of help rebalance my hormones, because when I was competing, I cut out a lot of the fats from my diet, and it affected my blood sugar because when you're competing, these carbs help with the workouts. And if you're trying to diet, you got to pull back from somewhere. So I pulled back from a lot of those fats, and that affected my hormones a lot. So it was really, giving my body a lot of the nutrition that it was missing out on before. And a lot of those anti-inflammatory foods, a lot of the healthy fats, kind of seeing what came back with that testing when I did that properly. I did get on things like thyroid medication. Everything else I tried to do without medication though. And then I went off things like birth control because that was really impacting my hormones as well too. And then I tried to rebalance my natural hormones. So it was a lot of different changes that I made based off of, my diet, and then trying to repair these things like my gut and the microbiome. And that made a huge difference as well, especially when it comes to like my mental health, because when all of these things are off, like when you have gut issues, you're chronically bloated, your hormones are basically non-existent, like you're going to feel like shit like every day. And it's really hard to be in a good mood. And then along with that, addressing a lot of those emotional stressors. So I go see a counselor now every 2 weeks, and I've done that for the last 2 years. And I think, unfortunately, there's a stigma when it comes to counseling. People are like, oh, there's something wrong with you, you shouldn't do that. Oh my God, everybody should do that. Like, seriously, to have someone to just like talk about everything that's going through your mind and your issues and work through things to springboard with, it's the best thing that I could ever do. And now that I'm like through all of that, I'm not dealing with it, I still do it because, it helps me sort through these things that, come about in my mind that I'm struggling with, whether that be work, relationships. So it was two things. It was the physical side, working on my diet, doing the proper testing from a functional medicine standpoint. And then it was the mental side, working with a counselor and sorting through a lot of those different things as well too.
I try to tell people all the time that I am clinically insane. So if I don't train and if I don't go to see my therapist, now I usually go like maybe every other month or something, but there's been points where I was going weekly. It just depends on what I have going on in my life. But with that stuff, and I'm a completely different person. I go completely insane. So I think it's so important for everybody to make sure that they stay on top of that stuff, the mental health as well as the physical health. And I just had a question for you. So for diet wise, the big thing for you was grains and then just adding some fats back in, or what was there anything else on there that you had to take out?
Yeah. So I had a lot of food intolerances, and I do an anti-inflammatory diet. So grains, beans, those are things like legumes, of course, sugared processed foods. I don't have any of those in my diet because they're a bit more inflammatory to the body. And then, so my diet it's very much a whole foods diet. So if it comes in a bag or a box or has a long list of ingredients, like I don't eat it. I also cut out things like artificial sweeteners. So when you're going through competition prep, when you're trying to diet, you use all these diet foods and they're loaded in all these artificial sweeteners and fillers and gums. You see that in protein powders and pre-workouts as well too. Oh my God, are these so terrible for your body? And especially your microbiome. And always what I tell people is, you're right, these are no calorie sweeteners. You don't absorb these, but something does in your body. And those are those little bacteria that reside in the gut. They love artificial sweeteners and they love to ferment on those. And if you read the side effects of a lot of sugar alcohols or sugar substitutes, you'll see bloating, constipation, GI issues. And this is because they're very fermentable to a lot of that gut bacteria. So it can cause that gut imbalances too. So I would say I was doing actually probably a lot of that. Again, kind of more focused on like the physique side of things, but that had a major effect on my gut combined with everything else. So cutting out those, and then I added in a lot of the fats, and I actually probably do about 100 grams per day, which is a lot of fats, but it makes me feel really, really good because it balances my blood sugar. And one of the first things I always do with my clients is focusing on balancing their blood sugar, because not a lot of people realize how much those fluctuations really affect, their weight, how they affect their mood throughout the day, because it's every time we get a blood sugar drop that we become a bit more catabolic, because that cortisol picks up when we get those blood sugar drops to try to fix everything because we don't have enough sugar. And then every time we get blood sugar spikes, that's when we get insulin. And insulin's like that fat cell fertilizer that makes us actually store more fat. So most people throughout the day are kind of like in this roller coaster. They're going through this hypoglycemia state, and then they get all these cravings, and they get cortisol rushes, and they're stressed and they're anxious. And then they eat all these processed foods, they're not getting the good fats and the protein. So then they feel good for a while, and then, insulin's raised, and then they drop. So most people are like that throughout the day. So, one of the best things you can do starting out too is balancing your blood sugar and getting that sorted out. And exercise plays a role too on blood sugar. And when you're overtraining, that actually makes you a bit more hypoglycemic as well too. Again, raising that cortisol. So always what I tell my clients is protein, fats, and fiber every time you eat. And then carbohydrates like starches are kind of based off of your training and your goals. So protein, I always place an emphasis on high quality protein because they're not all created equal. And I get a lot of people who come to me and they're like, okay, meat's bad. I forget the documentary on Netflix, and they're like, I'm going all vegan, because I watched this and how terrible. I'm like, you're right. Processed meat is bad for you. You do not want to eat that. But there's a big difference from grass-fed beef and grain-fed beef. So kind of going back to how grains are inflammatory to the body. And I always give this example. So you can think of like a person who ate all pasta and breads for their diet and what they would look like composition-wise. And then you kind of take someone who ate all things like fruits and vegetables and what they would look like body composition wise. So now you take a cow whose natural diet was actually grass, and you start getting them things like grains, and even in some instances they give them candy. It's gonna definitely affect the makeup of that meat. So the protein doesn't change, but the fats in the meat change. So grass-fed meat it actually has a lot of omega-3s, which are anti-inflammatory. Where grain-fed meat is pro-inflammatory, it has a lot of omega-6s. So it's not the meat that's bad, it's the quality of the meat. And it actually comes down to our food system and how much we try to mess with Mother Nature and change all of these things. All the problems have come about because of the way we mess with, these animal products, the way we mess with and make all these processed foods that basically we're trying to convince you are healthy, like whole grains, lots of fiber. But if we get back to the basics, like whole real food, that's what's going to really, have the greatest effect. And so the protein, getting high quality protein, that's like that grass-fed, wild-caught, pasture-raised type animal sources. The next thing I have them do is to get that good quality, healthy fats in. And you should get a little of that with every single meal. These are going to be like the mono and the polyunsaturated fats. So these are things like avocado oils for cooking, olives, olive oil. This could be nuts and seeds as long as they're not roasted in an unhealthy oil. So raw is typically best, or even sprouted. This could be things like fatty cuts of fish because they have a lot of omega-3s as well too. So adding in a little bit of fats, to those meals along with it. And then the third thing is going to be fiber. So I always say protein, fat, and fiber instead of carb, because when I say carb, most of us think breads, potatoes, pasta, but fiber is incredibly important for the gut and the microbiome. And also balancing that blood sugar. So this could be all of your non-starchy veggies, your leafy greens, it could be low sugar fruit. So again, these are all very whole food based options. And then if you're someone who trains quite a bit, who's active, and doesn't want to lose weight or maintenance, you add in some starches too. Add in some sweet potato, maybe for some people rice, things like quinoa, so you can add in some of those starches along with it. But the core should always be that good quality protein, some amount of those healthy fats, and then the fiber, and then the rest is kind of customized to each person.
That's great. And if somebody is going through, some type of digestive stress or whatever, would you ever suggest like a paleo AIP or some type of an elimination diet?
Yeah, so I do elimination diets all the time. AIP is great, especially if we think it's more, excuse me, an immune type issue. I do that with people who have autoimmune quite a bit. With people with, I think, gut issues, I do a low FODMAP diet. I'm not sure if you've heard of that before, but it basically cuts out all fermentable fibers. And it doesn't fix the issue though. AIP is great because it actually helps with repairing the gut. FODMAP diet's more of like let's try to cut out some of these food triggers. And if you respond well, we know it's probably a bacteria issue. So these fermentable fibers that you cut out, it's actually a really long acronym. It stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. So basically we call those the FODMAP diet. But we're cutting out all, we're cutting out all the food sources for the bacteria. And normally if you get a lot of relief, like with the bloating and the GI issues, that's a good indicator that it's a bacteria issue. It doesn't fix the issue, but you know it's a bacteria issue, and then that you may want to work on rebalancing that gut microbiome, maybe doing some testing, maybe getting on a good probiotic. But if that doesn't help, doing the testing, and you may have to kind of get rid of a lot of that bacteria that may be in excess in the gut. So that's kind of a good testing tool. But AIP is a good one for, I'd say, healing, and especially, if there's a lot of an immune response to go along with it. And I know they place a high emphasis on things like bone broth and fermented foods, a lot of those healthy fats and protein, which again are very healing to the body as well.
Got it. And do you take a probiotic supplement? Do you take digestive enzymes or anything like that? Do you typically recommend that stuff?
Yes. So probiotics, I think, is kind of individualized. So let's say if someone who has a lot of gut issues, sometimes if you add a probiotic, it's kind of like adding more fuel to the fire if bacteria is the issue. However, in most people, yes, we do want to be on a good probiotic, but quality is really essential. Getting one that has a good amount of bifidobacterium and lactobacillus. I even like Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a beneficial yeast, and you can take that as a supplement. But just pay attention to if you feel better or if you feel worse, because if you feel worse, that could be, again, a sign of more of a bacteria issue in the gut. But a good probiotic, for maintenance, especially if we're in good health, just to promote overall gastrointestinal health. And then digestive enzymes, I think that's kind of individualized too. I will say when my gut was a bit more compromised and I had more of the bloating, and leaky gut going on, I did take some digestive enzymes, hydrochloric acid, to kind of aid in the digestive process. So my body didn't have to do as much work. However, now I don't take any of that anymore. So it kind of just depends on where you're at and, what the issues are that you're experiencing.
Totally. And why don't we dive into the correlation between gut health and brain health? Because, there's a lot of people, especially right now, dealing with depression and anxiety and all these other mental health issues. And 99.9% of the time or 100% of the time, people aren't thinking about their digestive health. So why don't we dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, well, most of our serotonin is actually made in the gut. So if our gut's impaired, it's going to definitely affect our brain. And we also have what's called a gut-brain connection. So we have what's called a vagus nerve, which connects the brain all the way down to the gut, which is why when you're under stress, you can get a lot of those gut feelings, you get those butterflies, you can even sometimes get gut-related symptoms. Some people get like diarrhea when they get really nervous. But then it goes both ways as well too. So when our gut's impaired, when we have dysbiosis, leaky gut, it definitely translates to the brain as well too. One, because the gut makes most of that serotonin, but also because of that fact, the neurotransmitters affect as well too. So it's really important to address the gut and the microbiome. And I actually worked with a doctor called a gastroenterologist that's on the functional side. His name's Dr. Kenneth Brown. And he actually talks a lot about how when you have leaky gut, you actually have a leaky brain as well too, because of how interconnected the gut is to the brain. So, I'm actually teaching a course on brain health right now. And it actually is taking this functional approach, to why people have depression, anxiety, sometimes things like attention deficit disorder, because with conventional Western medicine, we do what's called symptom clusters. So you go to the doctor, you tell them you have depression. They say, "Oh, you have depression." And you're like, "Oh, I know." And they give you what? An antidepressant. Yep. Yeah. Or you go to the doctor and you're like, "I have anxiety." They're like, "Oh, you have an anxiety disorder." You're like, "Okay, here's an anxiety medication." And if you really think about it, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We do those symptom clusters. But if we can also take a functional medicine approach, there can be a lot of reasons from an internal standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, as to why we're experiencing these things. So the gut, that's going to come down to inflammation quite a bit as well too. So if there's inflammation in the gut, if there's an imbalance in the gut because of that gut-brain connection, that's going to play a huge role. But even beyond that as well too, there can be various deficiencies you have. We know that deficiencies in your omega-3s, so I've talked a little bit about that, but that's the direct ratio of the omega-3s in your brain. So the EPA, the DHA, these are different types of omega-3s that are needed for overall brain function. And no, I would say most doctors I've been to do not test your omega-3 to omega-6 ratios, which is incredibly important when looking at brain health. And there's a direct correlation with depression and a lot of other brain health issues when we're deficient in those omega-3s. And about 90% of the population, that's 90%, is deficient in omega-3s. So most people are, so most people need to be on a good high quality omega-3 fish oil, because the standard American diet has more of those omega-6s in it, just with what we typically eat. So you can look at, your micronutrients, things like vitamin D also play a huge role. We also know that blood flow plays a huge role. So there's this doctor, his name Dr. Amen, and he does brain scans on people, and he takes this whole functional approach. And he was looking at the brains of people who have a lot of these brain health issues, and then the people who don't. And the people who did had a lot less blood flow to various parts of the brain. So we can look at what causes low blood flow. Well, we know lack of exercise plays, low blood flow. Smoking, drugs, marijuana use, they show, can play a huge role in blood flow. And then what enhances blood flow quite a bit, diet plays a role, exercise, movement. There's supplements like ginkgo, those omega-3s that can play a huge role. So getting more blood flow to the brain. There can be things like looking at if there's hidden inflammation. So there's a lot of things that you can look at, but unfortunately, again, we look at it like you're something wrong with you when someone goes to the doctor with depression, with anxiety. And most people, because of the massive amount of shame that's surrounding it, people don't seek help because they're like, I know if I go to the doctor, they're going to tell me, I'm defective. There's something wrong with me. And they're just going to say the only way to manage my issues is to take medication. And in some scenarios, like 100%, some people need to be medicated, and they definitely do. But that's not the only solution. I believe in empowering people to make a lot of these changes. It's kind of like genetics too. It's like, let's say you're predisposed to have things like depression, to be diabetic, to be overweight. Does that mean that you're going to be? No, it means you need to pay that much more attention and to, take a lot of these precautions to address these things, because you do have the genetics. But genetics doesn't mean you're going to develop it. And if we can empower people and not make them feel like there's something wrong with them, but hey, there's something we can do about this. We can address your nutrition. We can address, your gut. We can look at your micronutrients. Maybe we need to address some things like trauma and the emotional side of things. And you know what? Oh my God, the outlook is incredible if we take this approach. And it gives people hope, and, it gives them that accountability. But it's a two-way street. One, we don't really give the amount of education, surrounding around, functional medicine to take that sort of approach, and two, you have to be willing to do the work. It's a lot easier to pop a pill, to take that route, and just to put a Band-Aid over the issue. But I think if we can really try to figure out what's going on, not only are we going to fix that issue, like the depression, or whatever else you're going in for, we're going to fix a lot of other things wrong in the process as well too. So the gut plays a huge role, but I think it's also just, it's looking at the whole picture, and functional medicine it's looking at how the body is an interconnected system. We're not just a random collection of independent organs. Everything is interconnected between each other. The brain with the gut, the brain with the adrenals, with the hormones, with the thyroid, they're all interconnected between each other. So we need to look at how, they all are playing a role versus just looking at them like individual organs and then just addressing the symptoms.
That's amazing. We covered a lot of stuff there, Rachel.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
So if someone is listening right now and they just want to start, they want to start today, right? They just want to get the ball rolling because maybe they have a little GI stress. Very general question, by the way, but
Yeah.
they have some GI stress. Maybe they're a little bit depressed. Where could they start with their diet? Like, what are some staples? What are some actionable takeaways that they could have from this show right now, and they could just start putting in the work ASAP?
Yeah, so first thing I would say to do is to balance blood sugar, because not a lot of people realize how much that's going to have a role in how they feel every single day. And I talked a little bit about the blood sugar connection with the adrenals, with the cortisol, that's going to affect your mood, your weight. So balancing the blood sugar, going back to that protein, fats, and fiber ratio, and getting that sorted out. A lot of people, old diet talk would say you had to eat like 6 small meals every single day. Basically, what that tells me is your blood sugar is not balanced, because if you're having to eat that frequently throughout the day and you're hungry to eat that much, one, you're not eating enough to fully satisfy yourself. Two, and then your blood sugar is really off. So blood sugar balance can be, a really incredible thing to start with when addressing the diet. And I think the second part too is you don't have to do this on your own. There are certain things that you can definitely do, like working on your nutrition, cutting out foods that are pro-inflammatory. On my website, I actually have a whole free download that dives into a lot of these different nutrition things that I've talked about. So you can do it on your own, but sometimes it's not just black and white. Sometimes we need to seek help. And I think it's just, looking for that person, that coach, that mentor who can help guide you, whether that be, more of a counselor, a therapist from the mental side of things, whether that be a nutritionist, a functional medicine practitioner, whether that just be, a health coach. Someone can help guide you. I think you and I know that the power of mentorship. Bedros is my mentor, and I have my own coaches as well too. So I do my counseling, and then I have a functional medicine practitioner I see for my health, and then a business coach. So I have mentors that are helping me work through all these things, because I know I can't do it on my own. And I think it's incredibly important to have, one, people who are more knowledgeable than you, can help guide you. So I would say those two things, do what you can with diet. If you're not eating a whole foods based diet, start there. A really easy elimination diet is Whole30. It's nothing extreme like AIP, or even like doing a FODMAP diet, but Whole30, it cuts out all of the junk. It cuts out the processed foods, the inflammatory foods. It's a 30-day diet, and it just gets you on whole foods, and it's really good at balancing blood sugar. And most people feel incredibly better just by doing that. And then from there, seeking the help that you need, if you still feel like you're having issues and symptoms.
Got it. And speaking of that, if people listening want to work with you, where could they find you, and how could they work with you?
Yeah, so if you want to work with me, you can check out my website. That's rachelscheer.com. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm do mainly all my posting on Instagram, and it's just at Rachel Scheer. So you can check me out on both of those.
Got it. Rachel, this was so amazing. I can't wait to go back and actually listen to this episode, because there was so much there. I want to go back and take some notes. So thank you so much for coming on. This was really great. I feel like I could talk to you for hours, but I want to respect your time. And thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
I know, it goes by so fast, right?
Definitely.
But yeah, thank you so much. It was awesome.
You're so welcome. All right. So just hang on the line for a second. But guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. And I will catch you next week on another episode of the Iron Life Podcast.